Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am Kristen Boyce, a licensed marriage and family therapist with a private practice, Pathways to Healing Counseling. Through conversations, education, strategies, and shared stories, we will be closing the chapter on all the thoughts, feelings, people, and circumstances that don't serve you anymore and open the door to possibilities and the real you. You won't want to miss an episode, so be sure to subscribe. Welcome to this week's Close the Chapter podcast. Thank you so much for being with me this week. We are going to be talking about getting out of your head and stopping the rumination and the looping thoughts. How many times have you had this happen? We all have. And we're going to be talking about coping strategies and how to shift out of that and tend to that. So be sure to settle in, or if you're doing something else, running, exercise, cleaning, whatever you're doing, anything around the house, feel free to put this on and tune in and listen. And be sure to grab the free journal. It's absolutely free. And this is what I do with clients. Pretty much every single client that comes in, we're using these principles and these exercises and this format to begin the healing journey, and it's free. So if you go to Kristen, Kristen, dboyce.com/free resources, it will be emailed to your inbox, and then you'll be alerted of any other helpful information free sent to you. I do blogs and videos and things along those lines. So you will be on the list and you'll be the first to know. So be sure right now, go to your phone, go to your computer, go to kristendboyce.com/free resources and jump on the list. I want to make sure I mentioned that. And I want to just acknowledge and thank you for sharing the podcast. The more you share it, the more people hear about it, the more lives can be transformed and touched. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's a passion of mine to change the conversation around mental health and being real with each other. So we do that by starting with being real yourself. And so thank you so very much for doing that. So let me introduce you to this week's guest, Brian Sachetta. I want to make sure I'm saying it correctly. Brian Sachetta is the author and owner of Get Out of Your Head, a book and brand series that seeks to help folks overcome anxiety and depression. By trade, Brian is a software developer. He combines his experience in the tech world with previous mental health battles to draw parallels between computer systems and the human mind and give readers practical strategies for evading their own psychological demons. Brian currently has 2 books on the market: Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety, and Get Out of Your Head, Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. His mission is to help as many sufferers as possible through not only those books, but also his blog and podcast appearances. And we really had a conversation about what helped him, what are his strategies, how did he even develop this? Because he's not a therapist. This is his own life journey that he turned into a mission to helping others. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Brian, and I hope it's helpful and creates a feeling of being less alone in this. Enjoy. Welcome to the Close the Chapter podcast. I am so glad you're joining me today for this special conversation with Brian Sachetta. Did I say it correctly?
That is right.
I'm so excited to have you here, Brian, to talk about all things about getting out of your head, because how many of us live in our heads? I'm like going to raise my hand at times, right? I'm a therapist and still can get in my head. It's one of those things. That's the name of your book. Am I getting that? Yes.
Yes, I got a couple with that title. So you're definitely on point there.
Yay. Okay. So we're going to kind of break down. I want to hear about your story. What led you on this journey? Like, let's just start there. What led you on this kind of, let's just call it mental health journey so many of us are on?
Definitely. Yeah. So it's a good point that you say that a lot of us are on this journey, right? I guess stepping back for a quick second, I run this brand called Get Out of Your Head. It's a website, book series, blog, clothing brand, all sorts of things related around mental health, right? Me trying to make sense of my journey, share it with other folks. I will say, like, I'm not a licensed practitioner or therapist or doctor or anything like that. I'm just somebody who's been through some of the same things that people who are listening to this podcast may have been through. And I want to, take my experiences, take my learnings, take some of the difficult parts and share them with people, right? I think, as you said, that a lot of folks are on this journey, right? I think it's important to expand the conversation and make people feel as though, or at least help them feel as though they're not alone, right? Because so many of us are on this journey. And if you look at the statistics, it's like quite a few of us that are on it, right? It's like, just pulling a stat out of thin air, it's like, about 20% of folks will struggle with depression at some point in their lives. And yet at the same time, like, depression is stigmatized, right? And we're all like, oh, it's not quote unquote okay to feel that way, or that's kind of the societal notion that we get. And yet at the same time, it's like, it's not okay, but like 1 out of 5 people will deal with it at some point in their lives. And I mean, between you and I, and obviously I'm on a little bit of a tangent, but it's like, between you and I, like 1 in 5, I think the numbers are probably higher because not everybody is going to the doctor and reporting what they're experiencing. So taking it back to, like, my story, my journey, a lot of this started in late high school and then early college, dealing with anxiety. So I think everybody experiences fear and anxiety, trepidation, things like that in different ways. And so, I'm not necessarily trying to say like, hey, this is everybody's experience. This was just my experience, but how it sort of came to be was like early on, right? As a 18-year-old dude, it's like all you really care about, or all I really cared about, my friends really cared about, was like, getting good grades, women, going to the gym, looking good, physically fit, whatever it was. And so I placed a lot of importance around like my relationships with women. And I just hadn't done, you're 18. It's like, how much inner work can you possibly do? But I hadn't done a lot of inner work that I have since done to, address some of my mental demons. And so in my relationships, anxiety would come up, depression would come up. And it was like early on in college that, sort of the story that starts my first book was one of the first few weeks of college. I had been seeing this girl. We sort of liked each other, but you never know where it's going to go or whatever. And she texted me one night and she's like, I'm coming over, and she's being a little like forceful or whatever. And I don't care. Like, I'm excited, but at the same time, like, I'm nervous because I could tell that she had been at a party drinking and I hadn't. And I was like, well, I'm totally sober. I'm sort of an awkward person. Like, I'm nervous. I don't know how this is going to go. And she comes over and sits down next to me. And like, my heart is racing. I'm like sort of on the verge of a panic attack. And then she's like, oh my God, like, you're shaking, like, you're freaking out. Like, what the heck is going on? You're like, you're a freak, whatever, starts calling me all these names. And it's sort of like, I want to put things carefully because it's, in the grand scheme of things, this is not the end. The story was not the end of the world. But at the time, as I was saying, like, when you're 18, it feels as though like your relationships with women and whatnot are like, they are the end of the world, or that they're everything that matters. And so at the time, this really put me, it threw me off. And I was, I woke up the next day, I was like, oh my God, that was such an embarrassing experience. Like, I'm humiliated. I don't really even know what that was. I need to go figure out, what I just dealt with. And then also from there, like, figure out how to move forward. And so that was the beginning of my journey, was basically like, if they were shooting a movie or something like that, the moment at which I woke up at my desk the next morning, sort of in disbelief, that would be sort of the intro shot of like, okay, this is where the journey gets going. And so from there, it was, it's a sort of an unsexy and long journey of just trying to go to different situations, try out different strategies for, my mental health, in terms of like, okay, maybe I go to a job interview and I'm practicing box breathing or something like that, trying out all these different strategies, seeing what's working for me, seeing what's not working. And then also just the ups and downs, right? It's like, there's times where you're like, oh, I'm on top of the world, I've got all this stuff figured out. And then 6 months later, like, you're back, in the pit of despair or something like that. So it was really just like me, a person, a guy wanting to make a little more sense of my own experiences and share those with folks, in the sense that, like, I wanted to just do my part to normalize things a little bit more. And so that's what comes forth in, my 2 books, my blogs, the podcast appearances that I give, stuff like that.
Makes sense. To jump back to what you were saying at the beginning about depression, it is lonely. I think the one thing that I can say with all clients that I work with is loneliness is right at the forefront. There's shame, feeling like, what's wrong with me? Something's wrong with me. Like, why do I feel the way I do? And that shame keeps people wanting to stay and hide who they are and suppress a lot of parts of themselves. So how much of your childhood, because you're on with a therapist, so we're going to get into that. How much of your childhood do you think impacted the way, not to blame, because I'm not into that, like, we're not blaming, but how much of your childhood impacted your anxiety and depression?
I actually don't think it was a lot, to be honest. came from a great household. My parents are awesome. I've got one sibling. He's a great guy. Like, I don't think a lot of it really had to do with like my upbringing, my childhood. It's possible there was a few events in there. Like, I'm making this up because I don't even really have a lot to go off of. It's like, it's possible, some situation at school with a classmate or something like that, like changes the way that you see the world on a subconscious level. And then like, you're off 15 years in the future, not even realizing that your brain is kind of on autopilot mode, directing you in this fashion. But I don't have a lot to go off of there. I think it was like, if I had to do some sort of like self-diagnosis, and obviously I've worked with therapists and we've tried to get through to some of this stuff in the past. I think it's more like from a genetic level, like some of the mental illnesses run in my family. And so I have seen it in myself, right? Ruminative tendencies. Like my brain sort of defaults to, overthinking, over worrying and whatnot. And that might just be like the way that, my brain chemistry is set up. And so a lot of it has been me trying to not override that, but trying to manage that, being able to say like, hey, this is my brain doing its thing. I need to step in here with some sort of executive functioning and say like, I'm not going to go down that path today. I'm going to stop worrying. I'm going to, use some sort of method to distract myself to get away from those fear cycles. So I don't know if it was really too much from the childhood aspect. I think it was really a lot of like dealing with like, I use a lot of in my writing, like evolutionary psychology and stuff like that. I like to say, and I think this is sort of an empowering thing, right? Is like, if you look way back in human evolution, and I mean, based on today's hypotheses and stuff like that, it's like the theory is sort of like, anxiety and like the fight or flight mechanism in general is like a way that our bodies and our like the species learned to survive, or it was sort of one of those things where it's like survival of the fittest, right? It's like if you in a control group or whatever, in a vacuum, you put two people in the forest, one's got a really overactive fight or flight system and one doesn't, and you put a bear in front of them, it's like you just got to be faster than the slowest person or whatever it is, right? So it's like over time, our fight or flight mechanisms helped us survive, right? It became this advantage. And so I like to say from an empowering standpoint is like, I've got a really great survival-based brain. The issue is that worked really well hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of years ago. Today, when we're dealing with modern stressors where it's like, those things are events on the calendar a week from now that you can't run away from, you can't stomp out immediately. That's where we get into trouble. And then that's one of the reasons why I feel it's so important to bring some of the strategies and insights that I'm not saying it in like a, bragging way or anything like that, but some of those insights that I've cultivated throughout my life, because it's just not obvious, right? It's like, you do have something on the calendar a week or 2 weeks from now. And maybe it has nothing to do with your past or your childhood or something like that. Maybe it is just like, overriding some of the older parts of our brains that like really start sounding the alarms when something seems a little bit scary.
Yeah, it's interesting. One of my favorite things to do is put puzzle pieces together. Like, oh, like, why is that a trigger for you? Like, why do you loop or ruminate on that? And sometimes we can't figure out the answer, and that's okay. Like maybe it is a biological situation, or maybe it is something you've learned to use as a survival strategy over time. And perhaps we do link it back to something someone said on the bus to you when you were 6 or 7 or whatever. And it's fascinating when we just open ourselves up to that exploration with keen curiosity, like, what could it be? What could have been the trigger? Oh, I didn't even remember that so-and-so said that to me on the bus when I was 7.
Right.
And I think keeping that keen curiosity about like what may be underneath something is part of such an important work, at least in my own life. Because then it's empowering. You're like, oh, there's not something wrong with me. That makes sense why I was triggered, because it reminds me of what so-and-so said to me on the bus, or I had this experience where someone wouldn't sit with me on the bus. Oh, then that's whole shame of not belonging, not being good enough, that kind of thing. And you're able to go, oh, there's nothing wrong with me. Of course you felt sad about that and you didn't get to process it in real time. So I think there is some empowerment that comes with just that exploration in general. I think that to tie what you're saying together, because sometimes it may not be something that you can consciously remember, right? It may not be it may be a genetic thing. It may be something else. And it's just worth that exploration to see, is it something else that lies underneath? So what are some of the strategies that you've learned to cope with that looping thought, like getting out of your head? Because that's tough. I mean,
it is hard.
We can say it. And then in the heat of the moment, we can be like, I want to get out of my head. I'm trying to get out of my head. So what are some of your strategies?
Yeah. So I think an easier way to answer this question is to talk about my first book. So it's called Get Out of Your Head, a toolkit for living with and overcoming anxiety. The first half of that book. So, I mean, the book is split into two parts. So it's like the first half I call it like, it's titled Zooming In. The second half is called Zooming Out. So by zooming in, I'm talking about like we're looking at and analyzing situations in which we are already anxious or situations that tend to make us anxious. And so we're trying to say, when we are already fearful, what are some of the things that we can do to walk back some of that fear in real time? The second half of the book is like, how do we make it so that anxiety enters our lives less frequently overall? What are some of the habits that we can cultivate? But so if we look into the first half of the book, that's where I talk about some of those specific strategies for, breaking out of looping thinking and getting out of our heads. So within that first half, I have what I call the 10 steps to getting out of your head. They're just 10 simple strategies that you can leverage when you're not feeling like yourself, when you're feeling worried, fearful, anxious, something like that. We could cover a couple of those. I do like to say like, they're not necessarily like rocket science. I mean, I do run the risk of like, saying some of them and then people being like, did this guy just tell me to breathe? Like, are you kidding me? Like,
I say it every podcast.
Yeah. It's like, it's so obvious, but
number one strategy.
Exactly. And I think, and that's kind of speaks to the fact that like sometimes it is hard to distill things down, right? If you just like post a thing on social media that says like breathe, that's like, dude, like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm so anxious. Like, don't talk down to me as if like just to say breathe. That's why I like, sort of long form media, like a podcast, like a book where I can, I can add in some stories. I can talk about some of the science and whatnot. So like, just to jump into the first step on that list, it is to breathe. One of the reasons why it's important is like from a scientific standpoint, we're talking about the fight or flight nervous system, right? It's like, so when we get really revved up, our fight or flight system or worried or fearful, insert any synonym that we want. Our fight or flight system mechanisms they're on high alert. They're running really fast. Like, our hearts are racing, our palms are sweating, we might have trouble focusing, whatever it is. That is called the sympathetic nervous system. And this is sort of just for your listeners. Obviously, this already, and then so the second half of, I guess like part of the autonomic nervous system, right? It's got these different divisions. So we've got the sympathetic nervous system, which we can call the fight or flight nervous system. And then we've got the parasympathetic nervous system, which is people call it like, rest and digest or feed and breed, where it's kind of like, when this kicks in, we are more relaxed. And that's a place in which like, we're not going to be eating when we're running away from a lion or something like that. And so when it comes to breathing, it's like scientifically, when we breathe in, we activate the sympathetic nervous system like a little bit. Our heart rates actually go up a tiny bit. And then when we breathe out, the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and we're able to, lower our heart rate. So we're like constantly like accelerating our heart rate and decelerating as we breathe a little bit, right? It's not like, hey, I'm breathing in and my heart rate's going up to 120 and I'm breathing out, it's down to 40. It's just a little bit of that. But at the same time, it's like when we are already in fight or flight mode, in order to get that parasympathetic nervous system to activate, we need to make sure that we breathe out fully and deeply. And so it's like, if we want to be able to do that, we also need to breathe in fully and deeply, right? And so it's as we're, bringing more awareness to our breath and saying like, okay, I'm just focusing on, taking a deep breath in, taking a deep breath out. We are trying to get that parasympathetic activation. And then that over time, it might take 20 seconds, might take 40 seconds, whatever it is, but we are basically sending a message to our bodies. Like it is, whatever I'm going through is okay. You can turn off the alarm, so to speak. And that's a really important thing because it's like when we are in that fight or flight mode, like we don't necessarily have the ability to think like super critically and analyze things. I mean, again, I always go back to like evolutionary psychology and whatnot, is like, if you're in the jungle and being chased by a lion, like, it's not going to serve you to stand there and think like, oh, well, if I do this, if I do that, like next thing you know, you're lunch meat or whatever. Right. So it's like being able to get that parasympathetic activation through the breath can then sometimes allow us to see things from a different perspective and say, oh, wow, like, I was really like, I want to speak carefully. I don't want to say the wrong words, but it's like, oh, I was making a really big deal out of this thing that maybe it is a big deal, maybe it's not, but I was maybe blowing it out of proportion a little bit, or I had become more attached to the anxiety than the event itself or the subject itself. And that parasympathetic activation allows us to get some of that perspective. So that's one thing that's really helpful. I could jump into a few of the other ones. I guess, just kind of off the cuff, right? One thing that I love to do that's really important for me is like physical exercise, like getting, when we talk about like getting out of your head, it's like one way that we do that is we get back into our bodies. And so it's like going to the gym, lifting weights, going for a run, super important for me, super important for, all folks around the globe, like in terms of just battling or fighting off anxiety. Not only because when we're working out, we're probably breathing, but also we're giving ourselves some sort of internal distraction, right? We're being able to say like, hey, I'm going on this run. I'm listening to this music that's getting me excited. I'm taking my mind off the worries that are currently in my head and I'm getting back into my body. So I find that really important. I think also it's just great to be able to, like, if you find, some music that you love, a favorite song, a favorite band or something, like, there's nothing more fun for me on a, like, well, maybe I'm using it. Maybe I'm saying it too strongly, but I love like finding a new album and then like going for a run with it and just like listening to the entire thing. It becomes therapeutic, if you will.
Yeah, for sure. I think when people start the breathing, they're thinking, oh, really? This is the strategy. I'm like, this is the strategy. Because when we're doing it regularly, then when you're really activated, you're like, okay, your mind goes, okay, my first thing I need to do is breathe. But if you're not practicing it regularly, your brain isn't going to automatically go to that. It feels like it would, but it doesn't, especially if people are having panic attacks. They're like, I can't breathe. Like, put your feet on the floor, center into your feet. Like you said, getting back into your body is so important. And I think the other thing is, with these 3 key strategies are great because you're releasing what's trapped in the nervous system. So movement helps release what is like bent up in the nervous system. So you're not suppressing it and pushing it down. That's one thing I work with clients a lot on is we kind of in our childhood, not to go back to that and dwell on it, but I definitely think it plays a huge role for people because our parents had anxiety. Like, we can't pretend like they didn't, because everybody does. Like, nobody gets out of it for free. So how did they handle their stress, their worries, their overwhelm? We don't talk about that. Like, I didn't realize my parents had anxiety. Like, were they shaking in a corner? No, but they definitely had anxiety. And then I'm like, well, how did they handle it? And when I started looking at how they handled their anxiety, it started to create some light on how I handled mine. It's like, oh, they didn't really talk about it. Or when they did, they got really dysregulated. But it's interesting to kind of think about things in a different way. They weren't bad. They're good. Like you said, people will come in and had a great childhood and they think we have to pick on something. And I'm like, oh yeah, no, not at all. But did your parents loop? That's one thing I've started. Did your parents have looping? We might not even know because we didn't really talk about it. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's funny too. We're talking about like genetics, right? Or like inheritance. You could say like, I inherited this, from a family member. It's like, I think most of the time when we say something like that, we're talking about genetics, but we can inherit behaviors, or at the, in a similar point, like at the very least, we have mirror neurons and we can sort of like reflect what they are doing, right? Like subconsciously, we see the behaviors that our parents are taking and we can, without even realizing, we can kind of integrate that into some of our repertoire. So it is important to, as you were alluding to, like, figuring out how they dealt with certain things and then questioning, like, is it possible that I learned this from them?
Yes. And when that curiosity comes, you're like, oh, I didn't even realize it. Like, it's not something you consciously even thought of because it's just automatic. To use your like the autonomic nervous system, it's automatic. So you're like, oh, I get to change that now if I'd like. Now, it can be tough because we've done it our whole lives, or we've seen it our whole lives. And the great news is we totally can when we want to do that. But these strategies, I was in a situation over the weekend where, like, this is what I like, practical, like real life. Like, okay, this sounds great in theory. And then when you get really activated by something, and it could be little things like people in traffic, or you're going to be late for something, or someone said something to you that created shame. And when I'm tired, man, it can be tough. So I think sleep, because I can feel my brain not being able to access that prefrontal cortex. And you talk about executive function, that rational, calm, logical side of the brain. When I'm tired, that kind of goes offline. I don't know about you, but sleep is essential to my well-being. Like, if I'm not sleeping, these strategies are great, but they're a lot harder.
Definitely. I think so. I do talk about sleep in the first book. In the second part, there's a really popular book by Matthew Walker, who's a researcher out at, I want to say it's UCSB. He's a sleep researcher. And I included some of his research in the book. Like, you think about, like, another way to put what you just said is that sleep helps us regulate the, sort of the older parts of our brains. Like, people might call it like the reptilian brain or something like that, but at the very least, like the limbic system, right? The emotions. And even if we are really good at the in the moment strategies, like implementing those, if we are not sleeping, then at the very least, more stress is getting into our brains, into our bodies, into our daily lives. And then we have to go to battle more often. So it's like, why not use some of those higher level strategies to reduce the amount of stress that is coming in? And then we don't necessarily have to use those strategies as frequently as we might otherwise. And the other thing too is, like, even though we can get good at fighting off stress or, mitigating stress, it's sort of one of those like death by a thousand paper cuts things. It's like you could be the best person at fighting it off in the world, but if you're fighting it off like day after day and year after year, eventually you're going to get burned out, and we don't want that.
Amen to that. So tell me about emotions for you, because part of the work I do with people is learning to be okay with that you have all these emotions and they help you, where we want to process and acknowledge them and tend to them rather than numb them, suppress, push down, or move away from. Tell me about your journey with emotions, and have you learned to connect more with those? And has that been helpful to you?
Yeah, most definitely. I think, obviously two emotions being anxiety or fear and then depression. A lot of the work that I've done internally is being more like getting to the point where I am more okay with those emotions, right? Because you talked about like when we push things down, we create more problems for ourselves. I like to say that we suppress them and then they fester. And then, 5 years, 10 years, whatever time frame, like something rears its ugly head and it's much worse than the original thing that we were dealing with. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing too is like I talk about candor in my first book, just being able to I think about like being an 18-year-old, and I'm not saying that like I've changed like 100% or anything like that. We're all works in progress, right? But it was like when I was 18, it was like, you went to the gym, you looked like you tried to be muscular and whatnot. And like, as a guy, right? Put on this tough guy image and be like, anxiety, I don't even know what that is. And like, all the while, it's like I am melting down inside, but nobody can know about it. And it sort of reveals this, like on the inside, it's like an unwillingness. Like I'm afraid. I don't want not only like anxiety and fear, but like I am afraid of addressing this thing that I am dealing with. I don't want to admit it to myself. And that shows that I like, whether it's me or somebody else, like we have work to do. Right. And so I think in the however many years, let's say that, that was at age 18 and I'm 32 now, it's like in those 14 years. And again, I'm a work in progress. I think we all are, but like, I've definitely made a lot of progress in the sense of like, I just don't care as much anymore, right? It's like, I'm willing to tell people like, I don't feel good today, right? I'm anxious, I'm depressed, whatever it is. It's not always easy to do that, but I have lost the inner fear of like the fear of the fear, right? It's like, okay, it's here. I have to do something about it. That's how I approach it now. Whereas in the past, it was like, run away, don't deal with this thing at all. And I think the new approach of like, okay, it is here, like kind of meeting it head on, not necessarily in a glamorized way and saying like, I'm going to war with this thing or anything like that, but being able to be a little bit more accepting of it and just be like, it is what it is. I think that allows you to, get to the table with what it is that you're dealing with in a faster and more efficient way. And then all of a sudden it's like, rather than like, I don't know, push it off and sort of like come up with all these excuses for yourself. It's like, I'm getting down to the negotiation table quickly because I want to move on from this thing and I want to get on with the rest of my life, if that makes sense. And obviously there's a lot of other emotions that come into play, not just anxiety, depression, but also it's like, if I'm feeling sad or something like that, it's like, becoming a little bit more okay with some of your emotions allows you to process them the faster. And then it's like, people talk about it as like a river and a dam, right? It's like, okay, you put a dam up on your emotions and then like all of a sudden, like everything is kind of getting blocked there. You let the emotions run through. And it's like, I guess the goal is you want those emotions, if they're not helpful emotions, right? Or they're frustrating or whatever, you kind of want to just keep them moving, right? It's okay to feel sad, but it's not in our best interest to feel sad every day of the week for an entire year or something like that. So it's a large and sort of nebulous journey in terms of like processing emotions on a high level in terms of like over the last however many years. But I think becoming more okay with experiencing them and feeling them and then saying to yourself, like, this is part of the normal human experience. I think that does go a long way.
Yeah. And I think the other piece of it to piggyback on that is when I loop, like if I'm getting into looping thoughts and I'm like in my head, I'm like, what am I not processing? What am I not feeling? What am I not connecting to emotionally? What am I not releasing? Because then I'm not connectable. Like I'm in my head thinking. And sometimes then I'm not sharing that with anybody, or I'm not sharing that in a journal or whatever. I'm not getting it out and processing it. So I just get stuck in my thoughts. And I find that when I share it and I'm vulnerable and I'm real and I'm like this weekend had a moment and I'm like, I'm having a moment and I really am having just a time. I'm exhausted. I'm tired and I feel sad. Like when I name it, then I'm more connectable with those that I'm in relationship with versus I'm fine, feelings inside not expressed. I'm not very connectable then. It's like, well, where do I go from? Like people just then don't know what to do then because I'm like, I'm fine. And that's kind of like an armor. And so when I'm more vulnerable with what I'm feeling, I find that reduces. And that at the beginning, it's hard because you're feeling like, are they going to judge me, reject me, abandon me, think I don't have it all together? I mean, whatever dialogue we have in our head. But I think naming it and sharing it is so powerful for connection.
I totally agree with that. I think it's funny, sometimes whatever that feeling is becomes like this elephant in the room. It can be like sometimes people don't know what it is that we're dealing with because we're sheltering it, right? But other times everybody can be aware that, something's going on. And then it's like, there's this elephant in the room, but it's like, no, there isn't. Like, don't look over there. Like, don't point at that or whatever. And so sometimes it is beneficial and helpful to be able to say like, look, yep, that is an elephant. And let's just talk about it. And then we can get on with our days with an elephant in the room, or maybe the elephant walks outside or something like that.
Exactly.
One of the first companies that I worked for after college, we interviewed this woman. I mean, girl, she was, 20, 21, something like that. And I will never really forget this because, I've dealt with these emotions too. But so she walks in and it was just like, I found it was like so disarming. She just walks up, she goes, "This is so awkward. I'm sorry. I'm so nervous." Like whatever, it was almost funny, like in the sense that she just like came out and said it. And I respected the heck out of it. I was like, look, you don't worry about that thing, right? Like, I'm not going to judge you about it. I actually just gave you a couple points for the fact that you were willing to come in here and talk about it rather than be like pulling at your collar for an hour and then being like, oh, I don't know how that interview went, right? We can, again, with like the river analogy, we can kind of let that emotion sort of run its course or just keep moving. And then we can get on with the rest of, whatever the event is or conversation, interview, something like that. So I thought that was I always enjoy that story.
I love that because there's something to be said about naming it and bringing it to the light. And then it creates more connection. Like you're like, oh, well, that she got points with me because she kind of brought, she was real about it. She didn't mask it or pretend or perform or perfect or put on this front. And you'd be like, well, that's not really connectable because it's not authentic. I was listening to a podcast. I can't remember which one it was, but Martha Beck was on it. And she was talking about telling the truth. Like she said, my New Year's resolution is to not tell one nothing, white lie, not to mask anything, to name it and identify it and say it for like 30 days. I'm going to not even if someone says, how are you? I'm going to tell the truth. If someone says, what's going on with you? I'm going to tell the truth. Like, I'm not going to pretend. For some reason that struck me as that because her mental health improved greatly. And then I'm seeing now research that backs that up. Like the more we tell the truth, the less confined we are in our own heads and our own bodies because we're like freedom, liberation, bring it to the light because the shame wants us to keep it hidden. And I feel like that is what disempowers us and dehumanizes us.
Most definitely. I think one sort of, I don't know what the right word is, caveat or something like that is to say that it's undeniably difficult to do these things, right? It's like, just because we're talking about them on a podcast, we're not saying like, oh yeah, everybody should go out and do it. It's easy. It is very challenging. We do have unwritten social contracts and social norms where it's like, this would be a little different based on some of the conversations I have in my normal life or how this person thinks about me, right? They may not associate the fact that I'm willing to be, vulnerable or candid or something like that. At the same time, it's like the journey starts with the first step. It's like, maybe we start small and we say like, if we're going to the grocery store and the person says like, hey, how are you doing today? Maybe one word, right? Rather than saying fine, your acronym there, we could say something else. And it does, we don't have to necessarily basically use the cashier as our therapist, but we could just say, hey, I'm doing okay. I'm a little frustrated today, a little anxious, something like that, right? And then you can just sort of see how that plays. And then you go to a different situation, you try that out. And it's not an all or nothing proposition, right? We're trying to expand a little bit, get a little bit more comfortable, start on the edge of our comfort zones and push out from there. And again, just to say that these things are difficult, they are challenging, but I think there are rewards on the other side. And that's why we talk about them. That's why we recommend strategies like these ones.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that because that is so true. Because we make it sound so easy. Just breathe or just do this or just be truthful. And no, we're so conditioned to protect ourselves from being judged, all the things that it's scary sometimes when we first start tipping our toe in the water to try some of these things out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to do a shameless plug here. That was sort of the ethos of what we're talking about right now is why my brand looks the way it does. And then also like the way that my content is structured, right? If you look at my logo for Get Out of Your Head, it's this like sort of like demonic looking like snake.
I noticed that. I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
this is heavy duty, but that's how
Yeah.
it feels sometimes, I
Yep.
think.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this like snake combined with this brain. And we're sort of pulling up different emotions and symbolism there. The idea is like, again, the journey is constant. We're kind of always on it. We're always improving, or sometimes going backwards, sometimes going forwards. But over the last 14 years, I was on this journey. It was like, I'm looking at different brands in the space. And like, don't get me wrong. Like I say this on basically every podcast that I talk about the brand on, is like, there are a lot of brands out there that are like mental health, and it's like sunshine and, rainbows and unicorns and stuff like that. And that's great. Like people do need to have a sense of positivity, optimism that they can get through what it is that they're getting through. This is just personal opinion. But what I feel those brands are sometimes missing is the honesty piece. And the honesty is the pain, right? If we just say, hey, like do this thing, and all of a sudden the sun comes back out, it's like, well, I just did that and now I'm depressed again. Like, what the hell am I supposed to do now? Right.
Yes. That didn't work. That didn't work. And I'm not doing that again.
Exactly. Yep. So my brand is, bringing in that pain piece and acknowledging it, not necessarily like harping on it and saying like, oh, this is all so difficult, we'll never get over it, but giving that piece its due, giving it its credit and saying like, this stuff is difficult. We have to talk about it. Otherwise, we're going to get to that point where we're like, this stuff doesn't work. Like, what am I doing? So bringing that piece in, I think, is important. And that comes back to the candor, right? It's like wanting to give this stuff its space and say like, this is going to be a difficult journey, but at the same time, we will make progress and we will get there in time. It might take a while, but I guess you got to trust, me, yourself, folks that you're working with, and we'll get there, but it could be hard at times.
Yeah. I kind of feel like sometimes people are like, I felt like I 20 steps forward and 30 steps back. And I'm like, welcome. You did nothing wrong. It's called this welcome to this journey, this up and down. It's hills and valleys. And when you feel empowered to have the self-awareness, that is so empowering. It's when we don't know ourselves or feel like we don't know what to do, we feel lost. And I think pain feels very dark. It feels very lonely. It feels very heavy. It feels like a burden and a weight you're carrying around. And when you start to say, you know what? I'm not going to keep going and pushing this down. I'm going to actually give it what it needs, which is love and nurturing. I'm making it sound easy again. It's not. Compassion. And I'm willing to really expand my window of tolerance for the discomfort, for the fear, for what it brings up, and go, okay, I can handle this and tend to it. The results, yes, you're going to still have stuff in your life. You're still going to have shame. It doesn't just disappear. That's one of the misnomers. I think people think, well, I'll never feel that again. I'm like, no, shame is going to come and go. That feeling of not feeling good enough. It's you being able to kind of love and tend to it. That transforms it rather than going, what's wrong with you? Talking to yourself in such a brutal way, which we all can do at times.
Yeah, absolutely. But you made a lot of great points, and a couple of things I want to jump on. I will say I get a little background noise right now, just like there's some construction going on across the street. I hope it's not too bad. But you had mentioned like, bringing in like the acceptance or some of the positive feelings and stuff. It's like, that is the point, right? It's like, it's not to dwell on the negative. It's the fusion of both the dark and the light. And
exactly.
That is inevitably a part of the journey. I think we have to accept both sides of that. The other thing in terms of like, taking steps forward and then taking steps back, and also, the dark and the light, is like, sometimes I like to think of like mental health or just the journey in general. Like if you look at like the stock market, right, over time, like the 100-year chart or something like that. And this is obviously not an economics or a finance podcast. And so we're not, this is a very, very high level analogy, not actually going into where the economy is and whatnot. But at the same time, it's like, if you look at that chart, the general direction is up, right, of stocks. But at the same time, even though like the country and the economy and whatnot is in a better place than it was 150 years ago, we can still have bear markets. Like we can draw down 40%, 20%, something like that. And so the mental health journey is one like that, where it's in general, the overall trajectory is upward. But there are going to be days where it feels like we are really, really down and we're not making progress. Sometimes it's helpful to look backwards and say, remember where I was in high school. I was an anxious mess. I was dealing with XYZ. sometimes we trade in a certain problem for a different kind of problem down the road. Sometimes that new problem is better or worse than the other. But in general, I think that when we look back, and this is not like, it's not a 100% of the time sort of thing. I think in general, the overall trajectory of like, hey, I'm integrating these new ideas, I'm listening to these podcasts, I'm going to therapy, I'm picking up different strategies. In general, I think we are improving overall. We need to sometimes zoom out, right? And look at the chart and see that that's happening, because if we're looking at the 1 year chart, things look really bad. If we look at the 100-year chart, it's like, oh, things are looking actually solid overall. We may just be in a little bit of a valley right now.
Yeah. And I think when we get in the valley, it's knowing it's temporary. Like it may feel like it's permanent and it may be a sustained period of time, but knowing that it's temporary, our brain doesn't know that. It feels like it's forever.
And it is hard too. I mean, I think we could have this podcast for several hours today if we wanted to. I think one of the challenging things is that like when we get into one of those states where, we feel pessimistic, we feel as though things won't go our way, helpless, hopeless, whatever it is, like with a change in state comes a change in our outlook and our story. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, everything is different, right? I'm looking over here and where I used to see flowers, I now see weeds or something like that, right? And it's this trick that our brain plays on us where it's like, we think we then need to go into the garden and pull the weeds and plant the flowers and whatnot. It's like, no, we actually need to figure out some metaphorical way of having the sun come back out. And then all of a sudden we look back at the weeds and we're like, those look like flowers now, right? It's this trick that our brains play on us when we fall into different states. It's I think Tony Robbins sometimes says state story strategy, right? It's a really important insight.
Yeah, awesome. I am so grateful for our conversation, and I hope you feel less alone. For those that are listening, you feel like we're on this journey together, because sometimes you just need to hear that. You're not alone in this, even though it feels so lonely at times. Where can people find you if they're interested in knowing more about you? Where can they find you?
Yeah, best place would be getoutofyourhead.com. That's all one word, no dashes, no spaces there. You can find my books, my blog, some of the merch on the website if you want to. Books are available on all the major retailers, but either going through the site or then, going to Amazon, typing in my name is the most helpful. There's another brand of the same name actually kind of going through some, challenges with that right now. So you might get confused. I would just recommend looking for me, looking for my name, or going to my website. That way you find what it is that you're looking for. So.
Yeah, it's a great name. It's a great title. I mean, so many people were like, I feel tortured in my head if I could just get out of my head. And all the strategies we talked about, I think some key ones today. And also, I think the takeaway from today for me, just with our time together, is when you can connect to your body, to your emotions, to what's going on the inside, it's actually what frees you from getting out of your own head. I'm summarizing. I mean, I know that's pretty, making it sound so simple, and there's lots of layers here, but that's my takeaway for today in our conversation together. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
I usually say something to the tune of what you said before that last sentence, which was basically, I hope that folks that are listening feel as though they're not alone. I try to come at my writings and my podcast appearances and whatnot, not from a point of like talking down to folks, but like being there with them. Like, I'm on this journey with you. Maybe that might sound a little scary because it's like the quote unquote expert that you're listening to also has his or her own struggles, but that's how it goes in general. Right. And I think once we can sort of tap into that shared humanity aspect, it becomes a little bit easier. I do put that message forth in a sense of solidarity, right? It's like, I want people to know that we are there with them. And, if there is something that folks are struggling with, like, I guess I would speak directly to the listener. It's like, you really aren't alone. If you do want to reach out, feel free to, there's a contact form on my website. You could reach out to me on Instagram. The handle there is also Get Out of Your Head. It's really just about building the community and helping people feel as though, they have some agency and able to move forward in their lives and have a little bit of just confidence that they can tackle some of the things that they're dealing with that obviously are at times very challenging.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I think there's something to be said about people that are also doing work, because it feels like there's a safety there. Like, I'm safe here because we're all coming from our shared humanity. And that's when I first started this podcast, I was scared to talk about all my, stuff, so to speak, which we all have, every single human on the planet. And when I started to, the feedback I was getting from clients were like, oh my gosh, you were so much more relatable. And I loved hearing those stories, and thank you for sharing. And that is what creates connection. Vulnerability is what creates connection. I know it's scary and I have to work on it every day because I was not conditioned that way and society hasn't conditioned us that way. Yet the tide is turning. We're thirsty for more honesty. We're thirsty for some of these deeper conversations. And this is the time. So thank you for your time here, Brian. It was a pleasure talking to you, and I'll encourage people to go and check you out.
Thanks, Kristen. It was a great conversation. And, you put it so eloquently there. Yeah, I don't know if I have anything to add. So just thanks for the time.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to the Close the Chapter podcast. My hope is that you took home some actionable steps along with motivation, inspiration, and hope for making sustainable change in your life. If you enjoyed this episode, click the subscribe button to be sure to get the updated episodes every week, and share with a friend or a family member. For more information about how to get connected, visit Kristen, Kristen, Boyce, Boice.com. Thanks and have a great day.